Are you starting for us, or should I start?
No, you go ahead, man. It's your show.
All right.
I'm just an adjunct here.
It's our show, I thought. Well, the show you've been waiting for. I'm just going to self-claim it. The Situation Room, as you know, is actually a TV show by Wolf Blitzer and Pamela Brown. Here, you don't get Pamela Brown and Wolf Blitzer, but you get Firas and Ram. And the idea is to talk about everything that's happening in the geopolitical environment, politics, all the uncertainties that have come through recently with the new administration, paint the big picture, talk about how that actually impacts everything we do in our lives. I think we're focused on ophthalmology, but on a biotech basis, everything that's going on right now has an impact on capital deployment, the risk analysis, through how people are viewing things. And we have 3 experts here today with us to help us have this conversation. I'm going to let them make the introductions for themselves, and then we'll start getting into some details.
Perfect. So I'm Cameron Taylor. I'm a managing director for the BofA investment banking team, focus on a range of therapeutic areas, but I think you've all known, spent a lot of time in ophthalmology. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing today.
Hi, my name is Laura Feinleib. I'm a managing director at Redmile Group. We are a healthcare dedicated investment firm with the vast majority of our focus in biotech and small cap biotech. We invest across private and public with the overall long-term fundamental thesis view.
So I'm not Derrick Lee. I'm James Murray, filling in for Derrick, who I think also got stuck in Newark. I'm a co-founder and managing partner of ExSight Ventures with Firas Rahhal, where we invest in early-stage ophthalmology technologies across the spectrum, so drugs, devices, diagnostics, anything that touches or relates to the eye we want to know about and potentially invest in.
I think I introduced myself earlier, but hey, I always open and close, so I'm standing between you and a drink again. And I always call this group the Last of the Mohicans, and this is maybe the biggest Last of the Mohicans group we've ever had. Good for you.
And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Palanki, Chief Commercial Officer at REGENXBIO. We're a publicly traded company. Have been around for a long time, and I think my colleague, Steve Pacola, talked a little bit about us today, so I won't get into it. With that, I'm gonna start to set the stage, and I've actually requested my friend Cameron here to bring some data forward because he's an investment banker. He has access to the latest stuff that's happening on a macro and micro environment basis financially. We're going to get into that, but Cameron, the basic stats today are the public equity issuance is at the lowest. Private equity markets have exhausted their funds in the last 5 years. Right? They've been deploying a lot of cash. Market performance for biotech generally has been very sad.
But getting better.
Yeah, it's getting better. But generally speaking, it's been sad, right? And the M&A landscape has been actually way more favorable to China than the US recently. So, you take those big picture items, maybe you can share what's happening in the financial world. You have the clicker, hopefully. I'll get you the clicker.
Hopefully it works.
So let's set the stage, and then we'll get into the discussion.
All right, so first, from a performance perspective, I think, where I talk about things getting better. And I think a lot of times, right, we focus on the XBI, we focus on DRG index. And so actually what we've done is separate into commercial stage biotech companies, companies that have filed and prepped, as well as then pre-commercial biotech companies by stage. And so what you'll see actually is that, earlier on in the year, those red triangles down at the bottom, it painted a really tough picture for all of biotech, right? And particularly for those that were pre-commercial, right? Which oddly enough are the same companies that need to be fed, that need funding. What we have had though, right, I think since the depths of sort of the post-Liberation Day fall is things have gotten a little bit better. There has been a degree of normalization, but still we do see pre-commercial companies dramatically lagging commercial stage peers. So what do we take away from that is it still is a market where, many of the investors are, what have you done for me lately? We are still seeing nice performance from companies after they get some of their clinical events. But nonetheless, it finds, many companies in clinical development still find themselves under pressure. And this is frankly, right after a few years of relatively significant pressure in the overall biotech field. But nonetheless, I think still green shoots here that we see, and still, fortunately, companies responding relatively well onto data. How does that play into public equity issuance? You know, we do find ourselves, frankly, down about 70% year over year, which was, you know, certainly a very robust first quarter of 2024, which drove a tremendous amount of momentum in the overall 2024 stats. But we've seen a much more moderate pace of overall deployment. There is still, I think, a fair amount of capital that is, you know, ready to be deployed, but it is much more infrequent, and we do see, you know, generalist investors largely on the sidelines. By and large, across ophthalmology, I don't see any particular differences in the overall trends within the public markets. For those companies that are generating, you know, positive data, we still have seen, you know, an ability for those companies to get access to capital, but far fewer opportunistic financings, and, you know, a level that is still kind of closer to where we were during the financial crisis or thereabouts. Then as it relates to the private side, I think kind of the most interesting element to this is really the 443 that you see under the 2021 bucket. Every other year, it's about 200. Yes, 2020, we saw 300 companies. But frankly, an oversupply of biotech companies and simply a similar amount of capital, or if not actually more, devoted to biotech, but too many mouths to feed, and that's why you do see a lot of news out there about down rounds or pressure, or it's much harder to raise capital because there are simply so many companies trying to do it. We do note, however, there still have been, you know, a number of very successful financings within ophthalmology, certainly at a slower pace, but, you know, nothing that we see, you know, very different from other fields. And then lastly, from an M&A landscape perspective, you know, from a banking perspective, we love to talk about those big deals that mark up the $10 billion plus, those dotted lines. But the reality is when you really look through sort of the steady state, the billion, you know, even 250 to $10 billion deals, that still remains pretty consistent. And I think the big takeaway is larger pharma companies still have available capital. They are going to want growth, and when companies do de-risk and do get closer to proving out that they have meaningful products and meaningful impact for patients, there are people willing to buy those assets. And so that, frankly, you know, still remains, I would say, a huge tailwind across not only ophthalmology, but all the whole field.
That's great, thank you. I have to give some more breaking news because the whole FDA had shifted, so I think we need to talk about it just for a second before we get into the rest of the topic. New administration, new CBER director, new CDER director. I don't know how much you guys have been watching the news. The new CDER director actually was the CEO of Horizon before, so I feel like there's a little bit of hope there that somebody's coming with drug development background. And then Vinay Prasad on the CBER side has been a controversial figure, epidemiologist, trained at NIH, hematology oncologist, but made some very controversial statements coming into the FDA. He talked about Sarepta that's going through a lot of process right now in terms of they took the product off the market, they put it back on the market. The last week has been a total mess. And they're talking about a big picture that they're going to remove red tape, but in the last month, there were 4 CRLs. Ultragenyx, Genentech received a CRL because they didn't have enough patients in the US. I think there's a nationalistic agenda that's happening that's also driving a lot of this political agenda on top of it, and then where does the science fit in this, right? So you take that whole big picture. I'm going to go to Laura. How do you view your investments today from a standpoint of risk, the uncertainty that you're dealing with on a regulatory standpoint, and when you think about private and public companies?
Yeah, I mean, so generally over the last few years, we've remained quite active and actually see this period of extreme negative positioning and depressed valuations as a huge opportunity if you have a long-term mindset and investment horizon. So a lot of the money, particularly in the public market right now, is very short-term minded, kind of very sensitive to this volatility. So we want to take advantage of some of these misvaluations. At the same time, in terms of shifting around investment strategy, there are a lot of public funds that have reallocated their exposure to only going into commercial names or into large pharma with less volatility. For better or for worse, we have not done that and have kept our focus on small cap biotech. But in this restricted capital markets environment, the cost of capital and cash needs is more important than ever. So we definitely start to have a much more of a preference for companies that have line of sight to profitability and or a strategic BD plan where they can get to that point with non-dilutive capital and partnerships.
And James, how do you view the world right now as a private investor that has a very different thesis and access to capital, right? I mean, Laura is at Redmile, it's over $6 billion under AUM. It's a very different approach and a long-term view. How are you viewing life today?
It's not great. And listen, it's a challenging environment. We started the day off with this. But if I had to sum it up, in addition to all of the issues that you mentioned, the geopolitical risks, the regulatory uncertainty, you also have to look at the liquidity issue, right? So even if you were to take all of that away, in the private markets, there's still a huge liquidity problem, right? Until some of these companies exits and some of this capital is recycled by our LPs, we're not going to have much money to invest. And that's the constant refrain from LPs, saying, I'm way over allocated to privates, I'm way over allocated to biopharma, I'm happy with what you guys have done, your DPI is quite good, but elsewhere, I need liquidity. So, and Laura mentioned, right, that looking at public markets, even us, if you think about liquidity, if you have limited dollars to invest, some of the opportunities in the public markets are so good and so compelling that you will happily invest in companies that are public just so you remove that liquidity risk off the table.
I'm going to get to a generalist question for you, Cameron, because you get to see the whole world. So what are the generalist investors waiting for right now? And from your perspective, what changes do need to shift as a sentiment for capital to be deployed again?
So one of the things that certainly will help, we do have a tremendous focus on a rate environment, but also the comparative performance of other sectors and where they've been able to invest. And so it is slightly cyclical, right? But we see generalists typically come into the market when there has been a wave of outperformance, within the specialist community. And so I do think it requires specialists, frankly, to continue to take longer-term bets and to start buying companies in the open market where they feel that there's a limited opportunity, right, to get in the door. But right now, right, there isn't that competitive tension. And I think both from a specialist perspective as well as generalist perspective, we're seeing folks willing to actually give up those returns into events or into earnings and into other these things to, frankly, prefer the stability and the predictability, right, of investing on the back end of those. And so, certainly it is going to, I think, come a little bit from the specialist community and then bleed into the generalist community.
Firas, I'm going to have you ask a couple of questions. I have two questions that I want to wrap up with after you.
Okay. Maybe I'll skip to the, we're short on time. Can I skip to this latter part?
You can do whatever you want.
You covered some policy things already. I was going to go policy, but I want to get to the ophthalmology specific area because that's all I know, actually. The rest is for you guys. Look, the anti-VEGF market has been absurd and huge, and we're all aware of that here. Are we at the top? Is there still room to grow in that area, one? And two, we always, James and I, talk about how high the bar has been set by these great drugs that I inject, thousands of times a year. Is the bar so high that competition is no longer valid or relevant? And specifically, how do you see the future new modalities fitting into the larger market, the new things like gene and cell therapy, the TKIs, the bi and tri-specifics? What kind of market share do you see and what kind of time frame in the overall anti-VEGF world? Laura, you want to start?
Yeah, in terms of the market and room for growth, you heard today so many stats about the dropout rates and lack of adherence. So if you think about the adherence-adjusted populations that are being treated, we're not even having, a minority of that percentage, addressed right now. So I think that's why these new modalities are more important than ever. As you extend the treatment durations, you can increase the amount of patients that are able to stay on treatment, on protocol, and continue their treatment for years and years. Also, and I think a really important part of these new modalities is they'll allow us to be able to go earlier in treatment and expand the populations in that way.
And I think certainly around, one of the interesting elements is looking actually how quickly the market shifted, towards Vabysmo. And granted, right, Roche had an advantage in that already held the rights to Lucentis in terms of how they could see the market and make changes. But I think it is going to be a market where I would absolutely not say, and it'd be crazy to say it given the amount of investment across the field, and so people much smarter than me are making that bet. But it will very much come down to the clinical data, and I do think it's going to get harder and harder to differentiate. And so I think it will be very important for companies to be very clear in their value proposition and how they're going to compete. And I take this from strategic dialogue and others, like what is going to get somebody to truly react and say, I actually need this to be in my portfolio. It's going to be a different angle. And so whether or not that's through a much more aggressive study design or trying to pick a particular patient population or going head to head against somebody else, like these are all things that I do think it is going to be harder in anti-VEGF land and in the anti-VEGF mediated diseases if you're also addressing them with new mechanisms. And that's just the game that is being played now, and also will probably happen faster in GA, where there still is a tremendous amount of opportunity.
James, what do you think on the private side? What about that conversation you and I always have about investing? We're early stage investors. The bar is high. These are big companies with multi-billion-dollar products. What's the future there? Can investments be made in early stage competitors?
Yes, I think so. I think you still can, but you have to, to Cameron's point, have a very clear value proposition on what else you are solving. Is it the duration issue? We've clearly seen that Vabysmo has taken market share, and duration is still a key element. We had a whole section on drug delivery today that showed that market share. And if you're solving other challenges, is it a bispecific or trispecific that also targets GA? Or is it solving atrophy or subretinal scarring? I'm now just parroting Firas's words back to me because I ask him these hard questions.
James has done a Retina fellowship in the last 2 years, 12 years. He's a little slow. Most of them are 2 years, but he's taken 12, but he's ready to peel membranes next week. Thanks, James. You're the best. I'm going to leave it for you, man. 5 minutes. You got it.
I'm just going to follow up on that a bit. I think we talked a lot about cell therapies today, gene therapies, especially when we start getting into IRDs and stuff. And I'm going to bring a view on a risk basis that recently Capricor, which is a company in DMD, got a CRL for, it's a cell therapy company, and they got a CRL for CMC. In cell therapies, CMC continues to be an issue. I think gene therapies have solved it to a better extent than cell therapies. It still is an issue. And so that's one CRL that was based on CMC in a very high unmet need patient population. Replimune in advanced melanoma got rejected because the FDA felt like there wasn't enough risk-benefit, though they met everything that they negotiated on the clinical trial. And Genentech was a surprise, actually, that they denied it based on 10% of patients only being in the US. So as this group thinks about what's happening at the FDA right now, I think it's really important to understand how you think about developing drugs and the risk that's associated with the new view that the FDA is taking. How do you guys think, Laura, how do you invest now, just given the uncertainty of the FDA policies, the broader statements versus the actions right now when you start thinking about investing into different companies?
Yeah, it's been really difficult because what we've been trying not to do is let the fear of the worst case scenarios paint our decisions. And despite there being some delays and some of these kind of surprise rejections that we've been kind of personally hit by, overall, the worst case scenario has not played out. And the FDA has been communicative in their intentions. And I think one thing that we've noticed about this administration as a whole and the FDA is they tell you what they're going to do. And so, for instance, Vinay Prasad tweeted that he didn't like oncolytic viruses. Replimune got rejected. And so I do think there's time to adapt to this new norm, and eventually we're going to get much better about predicting the outcomes and the actions of the FDA. I also really hope that the FDA kind of makes good on their own promises that they're doing in these tours and podcasts in terms of their transparency, their commitment to accelerated approvals, and start to really increase that communication between not just the FDA and the public, but review teams and sponsors.
It's interesting because a lot of these companies didn't get that view during their mid and late cycle views. They went through the whole review process, and
Right.
during both mid and late cycle reviews, they had no idea that this was coming, right? So it's the risk assessment through the process. I guess, Cameron, you've been probably talking to a lot of companies. What's the view out there right now from investors and companies?
Yeah, so it's been a big mix, actually. We've had still a number of companies saying the engagement has been there, we're getting good advice, the people are still there, the people we've been dealing with for years are still there. But there are still surprises, and I think there has been a debate as to whether or not, right, truly in the background, right, some of these changes are truly making an impact. And I think that's what's made a difference, right, even going back to your generalist comments, is, there is a desire. It's like, I just want to know the rules of the game. And I don't want there to be further surprises. I don't need Stat News actually doing, frankly, pretty darn good work to get things out of the FDA and to bring them to light. I don't want that. I just want a predictable FDA, which in some cases they're trying to do with the podcast, and they're trying to do that. And so, but there's time to determine whether or not that's actually going to come into effect or if it's just posture.
So just around that, I want all the three of you answering this question. So what can companies do now to survive and attract capital, both on the public side and the private side? James, you wanna start?
Partnerships, figure out ways to stay alive, particularly early stage companies, right? Figure out how you can leverage whatever you have, whatever data set you have to get non-dilutive capital and partnerships in the door. Talking our own book here, but Ravana, obviously, with that recent press release yesterday, really did a good job there. So that's what it's going to take to get the investors off the sidelines and taking a look at you.
Well, the strategics are coming next, so we'll ask those questions to
We're going to pin them down to that. Look out, Hallen. Coming for you.
Yeah, to that exact point, I think it's making the hard resource allocation decisions and making them early before your back is against the wall and you have no choice. Prioritizing your lead assets with the highest potential, and then when you get to the point where you're monetizing those, then you can feed that back into the pipeline and the platform.
Yeah, largely agree, right? Deeply understand where you're differentiated. Continue to execute on that. I mean, enroll quickly and move fast, because also the underlying burn of a company starts to creep up. And so operating as efficiently as possible still remains, critical for biotech.
That's great, isn't it? What would you guys think?
That was amazing. You
Time's
did it
run
like
out. We did a
literally
pretty
on the
good job.
second.
Thank you for traveling and taking on this. And Cameron, I know all the stats you pulled together for free. I appreciate it. And Laura,
Thanks to
thanks
all
for
three of
traveling.
you.
James, you're already here, so it worked out really well. Thank you.
Yeah, James stepped in
Stepping in.
for a missing party. Thank you all. That was wonderful. Thank you.